Okay, so here we are in the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. So as we start, lines 1 through 5 dictate who is included in this purchase. It's going to be parties, the seller, who is Jane Smith, and the buyer, John Smith. On the as-is, for any FAR contracts as supplied by the Florida Realtors, you can see here on the left-hand side, there are asterisks for any lines that have a fill-in, checkbox, or radio to fill in, okay? So it says these parties agree that the seller shall sell and buyer shall buy the property as described below. Line 6 through 11 describe the property, street address, zip, and city, street address, city, and zip. I'm going to put here 1484 Foxfire Lane, Naples, Florida 34104. That is Jack's address. That's located in Collier County. If it's Lee County, you put Lee County, Orange County, whatever county may be. And then we have our Florida property tax ID. Yesterday I showed where in the Collier County Appraiser's website you can find a parcel number. That's the property tax ID. If it's a Lee County property, you go to leepa.org. Using a personal example, you can click on site address and enter an address in. As soon as this pulls up. And then you'll have here, there's a strap number. And you can copy that and paste that into the property tax ID number here. You would edit that text. I don't think it's let me do the one it should. There we go. Okay. And then real property and the legal description is as follows. EPA, you'll find it right here. Or back to Collier Appraiser, you'll find it. Well, let's just click on this property. You'll find it right underneath where it says legal description right here. And you can copy and paste that right into there. Okay, click save, and it's now applied. All right. 12 to 25, just like the listing contract, talks about what conveys with the sale. It talks about together with all existing improvements and fixtures, including built-in appliances, furnishings, and attached wall-to-wall carpeting, flooring, and excluding specifics below 1E or by other terms of this contract. In real estate school, you are taught anything that is not affixed to the property can be taken out. So if it is a, if it's a couch, if it's a table, if it's a TV, if it's something that's not screwed into the wall, don't determine that it's going to be staying there. However, if it does determine if the MLS listing does say that it's furnished, you need to get a property list or a personal inventory of what is staying. On some rentals that are on some purchases that are formal seasonal rentals, they can say they're turnkey. So you might have things all the way down to dressings for the bedroom, drapes, other furniture, or other furnishings as well. 15 through 20 talk about refrigerators, dishwashers, thermostats, television mounting hardware, things like that. 21 to 22, other potential personal property. It could be the Mercedes in the garage. It could be the shed that's in the back. Things like that. 24 and 25 talks about the following items are excluded. It could say that the storage that is affixed to the wall in the garage, that is excluded because they're taking it with them. So that could be something they write. One thing I always say is get a personal inventory list of what is staying, get a personal inventory list of what is excluded. That way there is no confusion. 27 through 42, this talks about how much money your buyer is paying. 27, let's just use, and again, as I talked about yesterday on the listing contract, let me make sure I go with this. If you don't have an answer for a box, put N/A for no answer, okay? All right, let's use a purchase price. Let's say I'm going to buy this property. I'm just going to use a fictitious number of $450,000. Actually, $500,000 to make it easy. when it comes to buying a property, you want to make a seller known. The seller should know how serious the buyer is. Your buyer can put down a money, escrow money. They do not have to, but you tell your buyer, well, you should, just to show some seriousness. Typically, it's 1% to 5%. In this case, we'll make it 5%. So 5% of $500,000 is going to be $25,000. So the way you can work this out is say, well, at first, I'm going to give you $10,000. And you have three options as to when that can be given. It could accompany the offer, or it can be given within 3 days of the effective date. And additionally, you can give the remainder of that within however many days after the effective date. And we're going to say another 15,000 after 16. I'm sorry, we're going to within 16 days, we're going to give them an additional 15,000. And I'll explain why when we get to that. Lines 33 to 35 talk about the escrow agent. The escrow agent is the office in whom we'll be holding our escrow funds, and can also be the same office that will be doing the closing. Let's talk about that real quick. The escrow office is chosen by the buyer. But in most cases, outside of Collier County, the seller chooses who closes the transaction. If the seller chooses who closes the transaction, the seller pays for the owner's title policy. If the buyer chooses, the buyer pays for the owner's title policy. This is one big reason why we use this contract. This has a negotiated item here where we tell the buyer and seller who clearly pays for that. And you'll see that in a couple of pages. We'll talk about that more. Here, I'm just going to put John Smith's attorney at law. Their address is 123 Waterfront Lot, Naples, Florida 34102. Phone number 239-867-5309. Email bunch of letters at a bunch of letters.com, and 239-555-1224. There we go. Okay. Down here. Now we're going to talk about how much in financing. This financing is how much of a loan that the buyer will be getting. So I've got $500,000 for a purchase price. There's $10,000 in escrow, $15,000 in additional escrow. Now, how much money as financing will they be getting? Well, we're going to say they're going to take $500,000. They're going to be getting another $10,000 and then another $15,000. That's going to be the deposits. Now, you have to find out what type of loan your buyer is getting if they're going to be getting a mortgage. So if my buyer is going to be doing an FHA mortgage, which is 3.5% down, you're going to multiply 500,000 times 3.5%. And it's going to be 17,500 they need to put down. So in this case, your buyer's already put down the 17,500, which means they don't need to put down any more. But they will be getting a loan for 500,000 minus 17,500. They're getting a loan for 482,500. But on top of that, they'll be putting down an additional, let's see, 25,000 minus 17,500, 7,500. So that means they'll be financing 500,000 minus 25,000. That comes to that comes down to 475,000. But we're just going to say that they're actually going to pay cash. So we're not going to talk about a loan here. We're going to talk about cash. So we're going to go no loan. We're going to say they're not going to do any other financing. So we're going to put NA here. We're going to put $0 here for another loan. Let's go 0, 0. And after we minus 10,000 and 15,000, we're going to put that the balance to close is $475,000. This is how much they need to bring to the closing table. Okay. 43, time for acceptance of offer and counteroffer. This offer will be good for up to 2 days. You can put some pressure on the seller. by saying 1 day. You could even say no later than the end of the day today. Notice it does not specify for time, but if you're working on a computer, you can say today at 5 p.m. if you want. You can type that in, that's okay. I usually like to give 48 hours time. And then you see it talks about if there is a deposit, then it shall be returned to the buyer. Unless otherwise stated, time for acceptance of any counteroffer shall be within 2 days after the date of the counteroffer is delivered. So if you receive a counter from the seller on this offer, then the counteroffer is good for up to 2 days, okay? And then we have line 48. The effective date of this contract shall be the date when the last one of the buyer's seller has signed or initialed and delivered this offer or final counteroffer, the effective date. So basically that there is also stating that the effective date of this contract is the day that if there's any changes that is made. So the date that the final person has initialed or signed that. And then lines 50 to 54, we establish the closing date. Always make the closing date Tuesday to Thursday. That way, if there's any problems on a Friday, you don't have to wait until the following Monday. You can get something done by that time. So we're going to say it's going to be 30 days from today for a cash transaction. So we'll go with June 4th, which is a Saturday here. So we'll actually go to the next Tuesday, which will be the 7th. If it were a conventional loan, I would go another 2 weeks to the 21st. And if it's a VA or FHA loan, I would add 2 weeks from that. So that would make it July the 12th, okay? But since this is a cash deal, I'm going to go 1 month to June 7th. Now, if for any reason this deal were unable to be closed due to the lender, then the deal can be pushed out an additional 7 days. This is paragraph A talks about if there's any reason why that the lender can't push it out regarding paperwork, or for some reason they are having some issues, we can extend the closing by 7 days. 61 to 63 says that if for some reason, through an act of God, that the closing is unavailable, then there is an ability to move the closing as well. That's talked about later on. We'll go over that once we get to that part. 64 to 82 talks about if there is a tenant at the closing and transfer for occupancy. So unless paragraph 6B is checked, which you'll see right here, at closing, the seller shall receive the keys and anything else that allows occupancy or allows entrance to the property. So garage door openers, keys, or anything else for entrance to the property, and that the seller shall have removed all property other than what was noted in the original transaction and MLS listing. And that at that point, once they have taken control and said, okay, this property looks good, the buyer assumes all risk of the property from there on out. And from that point, they are responsible and liable for maintenance, shall have occupied the property at that point, okay? Line 72, now, what happens if the buyer is not going to be moving in on the date of closing? What happens if there is a lease? If the property is subject to a lease or any occupancy agreements, including seasonal and short-term vacation rentals after closing, or is intended to be rented or occupied by third parties beyond closing, the facts and terms thereof shall be disclosed in writing by buyer to seller, and copies of the written lease shall be delivered to the buyer all within 5 days after the effective date. If the buyer determines in the buyer's sole discretion that the leases or terms of occupancy are not acceptable to buyer may terminate this contract by delivering a written notice of such selection to seller within 5 days after receipt of above items from seller, and buyer shall be refunded the deposits, thereby releasing both of them from all further obligations of this contract. Essentially, if the buyer doesn't like the lease, they can cancel within 5 days of receiving that information. Estoppel letters and seller's affidavit shall be provided pursuant to standard D, which is below, except that tenant estoppel letters shall not be required on seasonal or short-term vacation rentals. If property is intended to be occupied by seller, this is important to note. If property is intended to be occupied by seller after closing, or C, rider, U post, closing, occupancy by seller. Basically, the seller needs somewhere to live while they're waiting for a new construction property to be completed. At that point, the seller pays as a rental to the buyer at some rate as determined, and that way they rent the property back. 83 to 85, I'll not talk much about, but essentially, if you have an investor who's buying a property they're going to tear down the property, and they're going to reassign the property to another end user. This is what this is really talking about. They may assign the contract to be released from further obligation, or may not be released from it under this contract, or they may not assign this contract at all. Always check the third box. Plain and simple. That's the only answer I'm telling you about right now. Now we talk about the financing of the property. How is it being paid for? Financing, letter A. This is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. For this purposes, we're checking box A. But let's talk about if there's were a financing contingency. Here's how you would fill it out. If your buyer is getting a mortgage, you would check box B. And here you would say this is a contract which is contingent upon within 30 days after the effective date of the buyer obtaining approval of a what type of loan, conventional FHA or VA or other being hard money loan or any other type of loan product that a lender comes up with. For this purpose, I would say conventional, and then other. Describe loan for purchase of the mortgage for property. Check one. This would be up to the lender if it's fixed rate, adjustable rate, and then fixed or adjustable rate in the loan amount. See paragraph 2C at initial interest rate not to exceed. So here, we say paragraph 2C, that's right here, 39, 2C, okay? Coming back down here. At an initial interest rate not to exceed, I'm going to leave it blank. If left blank, then prevailing rate based on buyer's credit worthiness. We do not know the credit. We are not credit experts. We are not lenders. So we do not know their prevailing rate. So leave it blank. And for a term of 30 years. If the seller, or I'm sorry, if the buyer gets a 15-year mortgage, great, fantastic. That's up to them. And then 2, buyer's mortgage broker or lender having received an appraisal or alternative valuation of the property satisfactory to lender, if either is required by lender, which is sufficient to meet the terms required for lender to provide financing for buyer and proceed to closing. Buyer shall make application for financing within 5 days, always 5, not 6, 5. After effective date, and use good faith and diligent effort to obtain approval of a loan meeting the financing and appraisal terms of paragraph 8B, 1 and 2 above, loan approval. Within the loan approval period and thereafter to close this contract, loan approval which requires buyer to sell their property shall not be considered loan approval unless rider V is attached. Okay. 102, buyer's failure to use good faith and diligent effort to obtain loan approval during the loan approval period shall be considered a default on the terms of this contract. For purposes of this provision, diligent effort includes but is not limited to timely furnishing all documents and information required by buyer's mortgage broker and lender and paying for appraisal and other fees and charges in connection with buyer's application for financing. Buyer must keep up with the requests and application necessary. 106 to 110. Buyer has the obligation to keep all parties informed about the status of the loan. If they are declined or if they are approved, and they must keep everybody informed about the status of the loan and where they're at. 111 to 114, if within the loan approval period, buyer shall, the obtaining the loan approval period, they shall notify seller of same in writing prior to expiration of the loan approval period. If they are unable to do so within the loan approval period, but buyer is satisfied with their ability to obtain the loan approval and proceed to closing, they can deliver notice to the seller, just letting them know of that prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. 115 to 119. If the buyer is unable to obtain the loan approval or cannot timely meet the terms, all after the exercise of good faith and diligent effort, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination to the seller, whereupon provided buyer is not in default on the terms of this contract, and buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing buyer and seller from obligations of this contract. Most of the time, in order for them to do that, the lender needs to provide some type of notice saying the buyer cannot be approved for lending. So there needs to be some kind of letter of denial or something to that effect. Lines 120 to 125, if the buyer fails to deliver any of this above, seller prior to expiration of the loan approval period, then the buyer shall proceed forward as though all obligations have been met and had been checked as of the effective date, However, the seller may elect to terminate the contract by delivering a written notice of termination to buyer within 3 days after expiration of the loan approval period, and provided the buyer is not under default under these terms, and the buyer shall be refunded their deposit, thereby releasing buyer and seller of all obligations. So if the seller said, okay, well, I don't think that you're going to be able to pass this, then the seller can say, okay, well, we're going to cancel your contract and you'll get your deposit back. So that's about the seller actually having some empathy or sympathy towards the buyer. Lines 126 to 131, if the buyer has timely provided either written notice provided above and buyer therefore thereafter fails to close this contract, the deposit shall be paid to seller unless failure to close is due to the seller's inability to satisfy contingencies of the contract or the property related conditions of the loan approval have not been met, excluding the appraisal valuation, unless such conditions are waived by the provisions of the contract, in which event the buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing all parties from their obligations. Okay. And then there are two other options. Either the buyer can assume the existing mortgage or they can purchase a money note and mortgage to seller. The last option there, I don't really talk too much about. Very inexperienced at that and not usually a good idea. Okay. 134 talks about closing costs, fees, and charges. You can use these lines to explain what the buyer and seller are responsible for as far as closing costs and fees go. I typically leave this to the closing office. You can provide a cost and estimate of what they will be paying. 135 is what the seller pays, and then 146 is what the buyer pays. So you can read through that at your leisure. One thing that you can note here is that 141 talks about FIRPTA and how this works out for a seller. And then also there's another box here where it says other. You can actually take a couple of the items and mark them from the buyer to the seller or vice versa and say the seller will pay for this, or on the other side, say that the buyer will pay for that. Line 155 talks about title evidence and insurance. At least blank number of days. If left blank, then 15 days. Or if paragraph 8A is checked, then 5. If you look above on page 2, 8A is line 88 where it says this is a cash transaction. So that would make it 5 days. At least 5 days prior to the closing date. So we're going to put 5 here. And I'm going to put NAs on both these boxes. Prior to closing date, a title insurance commitment issued by a Florida licensed title insurer with legible copies of instruments listed as exceptions attached thereto. Title commitment after closing an owner's title policy of title insurance shall be obtained and delivered to buyer. If seller has an owner's policy of title insurance covering the real property, seller shall furnish copy to buyer and closing agent within 5 days after effective date. Again, if seller has an owner's policy of title insurance. There's a lot of times that they don't. If they did have one existing in the past, the title companies usually can find it. That's typically how we get it. The owner's title policy premium, title search, and closing services shall be paid as set forth below. The title insurance premium charged for a title policy, and then the owner's policy will be calculated and allocated in accordance with Florida law, but may be reported differently on certain federally mandated closing disclosures and etc. there. Okay, 168 through 180 here. This is important to note. This is who pays for the closing agent and owner's policy and charges. Again, Collier County, typically the buyer picks. But this is why we tell you to use this contract, because you can actually designate in this contract who pays for what side. If it's Lee County, the buyer should always pick this box. Seller shall designate closing agent and pay for owner's policy charges, and buyer shall pay the premium for buyer's lender's policy and close charges for closing services related to the lender's policy, endorsements of loan closing, and etc. there. 172. Buyer shall designate closing agent and pay for owner's policy and charges for services relating to their lender's policy, and so on. 174 to 180, I'm not going to talk much about since I actually don't understand this part of it because we are not in Miami-Dade and we don't have services relating to that. I'm going to check line 168 actually, and then I'm going to put N/A over here, okay? Survey 181, at least 5 days prior to closing date. Buyer may, at buyer's expense, have the real property surveyed and certified by a registered Florida surveyor. If seller has a survey covering the real property, a copy shall be furnished to buyer and closing agent within 5 days after effective date. A lot of times they do, a lot of times they don't. Survey is good to have. It helps show any encroachments or anything by other properties from neighbors. Line 184 to 187 talks about a home warranty. There are plenty of home warranty programs out there. You can get them. You can actually say that the seller will issue a home warranty by, let's just use Home Tech as one of those companies. And then at a cost not to exceed, let's just say $600. And then it explains what a home warranty program is. 188 to 202 talks about special assessments. Special assessments are if there is a fountain installed out in the main lake of the community, then everybody in the community pays $100 on their main HOA, or if a sub-association has a new clubhouse installed and they're all charged $5,000, everybody has to pay either in installments or in full. You get options, and depending on when people were notified about it, whether it's in installments or you're required to pay in full, the buyer can say, I will take over installment payments, or I'm requiring the seller to pay in full. If I'm the buyer, I want the seller to pay it in full. Or if I want the contract to be more convincing for the seller to take mine, I'll pick letter A. Now below it talks about disclosures. These are important to note, and this is why you tell your buyer to always get inspections. So these are some important things. Radon gas. Radon gas is an actually occurring radioactive gas and can be found in some homes, so you want to make sure that they get an inspection for it. Permit disclosures, except as may have been disclosed by a seller or buyer in a written disclosure. Seller does not know of any improvements made to the property which were made without required permits or made pursuant to permits which have not been properly closed or otherwise disposed of pursuant to section 553. If seller identifies permits which have not been closed or improvements were not permitted, then seller shall promptly deliver to buyer all plans, written documentation, or other information seller possesses knowledge and everything else. We cannot determine permits. You want to work with, you try to tell your buyer to work with a real estate attorney to determine the permits, and it's the seller's responsibility and obligation to work with the buyer to make sure all permits are closed out by the time the property goes to closing. There's a mold disclosure. Mold is naturally occurring in Florida and may cause health hazards or risks. So they're told to get a inspection regarding that. Flood zone and elevation certificate. All Florida is in the flood zone. The buyer is given a certain amount of time to seek out flood insurance, up to 20 days within the effective date. They're allowed to find out if the property is insurable or not, and if it's not, they can actually terminate the contract, or if they don't like the premium for the flood insurance. So this paragraph here details about that. So an elevation certificate is certainly necessary, especially if it's a mortgage. They do need to seek out flood insurance, and FHA requires federally recognized flood provider. Energy brochure. Buyer acknowledges receipt of the Florida Energy brochure rating information brochure required by section 553. Lead-based paint. Depends if the house is prior to 1978. There's a whole lead-based paint that's available under the Naples Airport or Realtors folder. Homeowner Association. Buyer should not execute this contract until buyer has received and read the Homeowner Association community disclosure. That talks about how much the association fees are. Your buyer should not have this contract delivered until they see it and understand how much the fees are per month, quarter, or year. Buyer should not rely on the seller's current property taxes. You do not tell your client, oh, hey, look, their taxes are $1,700. If they sign a contract for $1 million property, their taxes are not going to be $1,700 the following year. They're going to be somewhere between 1 to 1.25%, depending on their actual tax and living situation. It might be a homestead property for them. They may be a disabled veteran. They may be a widow or widower. So you have to take all of that into account. You can give them a quote, but you can't tell them your taxes are going to stay the same. They're going to change. It's going to happen. Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. If your buyer is a foreign national and they're not a resident of the United States, get them hooked up with a FERPTA specialist, somebody or a tax accountant as soon as possible, so that they understand what the potential ramifications of being a foreign investor are. That is can be a big thing, especially once they go to sell. They can see a big tax chunk taken out, or a big chunk taken out of the property to be held back for taxes. Seller's disclosure. Here it says seller knows of no material effects, knows of no facts material affecting the value of the real property which are not readily observable. Again, always the seller should be filling out a seller disclosure to tell your buyer, here's what the property looks like from a physical standpoint, as far as the condition of the countertops, the condition of the piping, flooding, insurance claims. Here's how old the AC is, other things like that. So there is a seller's disclosure that should be made available in the supplements in the MLS for your buyer. Then we talk about property maintenance. You see, this is property maintenance, condition inspections, and examinations. This 257 and 259 is important to note. It says that the seller should make the property should be maintained as is the contract, the property should be maintained as it was as of the effective date when the contract was signed. Okay. And then under property inspection, right to cancel, here your buyer shall have up to 15 days, that's default by this, after the effective date, within which to have such inspections of the property performed as buyer shall desire during the inspection period. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is unacceptable to buyer may determine this contract by delivering written notices of such election to seller prior to expiration of the inspection period. If buyer timely terminates his contract, the deposit shall be returned to buyer. Thereupon, buyer and seller shall be released of all further obligations. Basically, if the buyer rolls over and decides they don't want the property, they should say, see you later, bye. However, if there are any damages or anything that happens from the inspection process, the buyer is responsible for those repairs, okay? Line 275 to 279, walkthrough inspection, reinspection. If the seller did agree to any kind of inspections or anything, the seller should allow the buyer back into the property to verify those are done. And prior to closing, there is a reinspection to which the buyer has a walkthrough to say, yes, this property is in the condition as it was when I first signed my contract. I agree and I accept the property. We can go to close. 280 to 288, again, talking about the permit, seller assistance, cooperation, close out of building permits. The seller shall obligate to cooperate and close out all permits and do what needs to be done to get it done, to handle that. 289 to 291, assignment of repair and treatment contracts and warranties. Any contracts and warranties shall be conveyed to the buyer. Maybe there's a 5-year pest warranty or pest contract, and maybe the fridge or stove have extended warranties on them. Those should be conveyed to the buyer unless the seller's taking them with them for some reason. Escrow agent or broker, this determines who the escrow agent and their, who they are, what their responsibilities are. So 293 to 312 talks about that. We here at Waterfront Realty Group do not take escrow money deposits as far as sales go, so we stay out of that realm. That should always go to a real estate attorney's office. Lines 313 to 334 talk about the professional advice or broker liability. I'm going to break this down to one simple sentence. We are not experts in all fields of labor. We are only experts in real estate. So if your buyer asks you, hey, what do you think about that roof? Well, here's my personal opinion, but we need to get a professional, opinion. We need to get this professionally handled. We cannot tell somebody, here's what I think. We need to tell them, here's, you need to call this guy. A personal opinion is not a professional opinion. So you need to always use a roofer, use a general contractor, use an attorney, use a tax accountant, because we're not professionals. You might be you might have a lender's license. You might have a general contractor's license. We do have agents who hold those licenses. In those cases, that's a little different, but you can still be held and liable, and we try to avoid those things. So try to have another person available that can help out. Default and dispute resolution. So basically, if the buyer defaults upon the contract in any such way that their deposit gets captured by the seller, then the seller must split that with the listing broker, and the listing broker then must split that with the cooperating broker. If the seller defaults, this is more important to note. If for any reason other than failure of the seller to make seller's title marketable after reasonable diligent effort, seller fails, neglects, or refuses to perform seller's obligations, buyer may elect to receive return of their deposit without thereby waiving any action for damages related to seller's breach, and pursuant to paragraph 16, may seek to recover such damages or seek specific performance. 351 to 362 talks about dispute resolution and things that they can follow through here. There's a process as to whether or not if there's a dispute over their deposit. There's like a escrow deposit disbursement order that that the attorney goes through. So we again, typically we don't get in the middle of that since we don't hold those deposits, but that'll be some reading that you want to do to understand. Typically, you really just go to a real estate school and hear about it, but you don't really get in between that. So this is just kind of a contract and just some wording for the buyers to see. Attorney's fees and costs shows you who's pays for what. Now we talked on page 7, line 369, the standards. This talks about title, title evidence, restrictions, easements, limitations within the time period established in paragraph 9C. The title commitment with legible copies. The title commitment shall set forth those matters to be discharged by seller out of foreclosing, shall provide that upon recording the deed. Notice policy of title, subject only to the following matters: comprehensive land use, zoning, and other restrictions. So these parts, these are really more for the buyer to understand and see. Title examination, the buyer has 5 days after receiving the title commitment to examine it and notify seller in writing of any specific defects. This is more with the title attorney and some of the work that they do. Here again, you have the survey, ingress, and egress. One important note is the lease information. If the property is under a lease at closing, line 413, seller shall at least 10 days prior to closing furnish the buyer estoppel letters from the tenant occupants specifying the nature and duration of occupancy, rental rates, advance rent, security deposits paid by tenants or occupants. If seller is unable to attain such information, then the same information shall be furnished by seller to buyer within that time period in the form of a seller's affidavit, and buyer may thereafter contact them to confirm such information. If any differ from seller's representation, the leases provided pursuant to paragraph 6 or any of that, buyer may deliver written notice within 5 days of such information, but no later than 5 days prior to closing, terminating this contract and receive a refund of the deposit. Basically, if the buyer feels that the seller is lying to them and found out different things from the tenants, then the buyer can say, okay, well, you're lying to me, so I'm going to cancel my contract. So you can see that on rentals, the buyer can step away even a few days prior to the closing. 424 to 431 talks about liens. And what happens if there are liens in the properties, what kind of time frame that the seller has to get those taken care of. 432, times of the essence of the contract. Calendar days based on where the property is located shall be used in computing time periods. If the seller and buyer agree to a contract on a Monday and there's 15 days, that means that the contract is then 15 days inspection period begins on a Tuesday and ends on Wednesday, 2 weeks following. 3 days for an escrow deposit to be delivered, that ends on Thursday the same week. Every other thing starts the day after. Day 1 is the day after the effective date of the contract. Line 439 talks about force majeure, aka act of God or any kind of weather event. If for some reason, some kind of act of that, the closing can be extended up to 7 days without any issue. But if it does get extended more than 30 days, the parties may agree that the contract can be terminated without obligations. 453 is conveyance to the property. Seller shall convey a marketable title to the real property by statutory warranty, trustees, personal representatives, or guardian deed. Personal property shall request the buyer be transferred by absolute bill of sale or warranty title, subject only to matters provided by sale in this contract. 458 to 463 talks about the closing location documents and procedure. Just basically, location happens where the location of in the same county as the location of the property, unless the office of the closing agent is in a different county. 464 to 468 closing documents are usually sent out within 24 hours to the buyers and sellers. The FinCEN GTO reporting obligation, if closing agent is required to comply with U.S. Treasury, it describes a little bit about that information. Procedure, the deed shall be recorded upon collection of all closing funds. If the title commitment provides insurance against adverse matters pursuant to section this is amended, the escrow closing procedure required by standard J shall be waived. And closing agent shall, subject to collection of all closing funds, disperse at closing the brokerage fees to broker, and then the net sale proceeds to seller. Escrow closing procedure, this talks about how the closing procedure goes down and how things all kind of flow through there. Prorations and credits, this is more for your buyers and sellers. You can use this to describe to them what's prorated, how some of the credits play out, access to the property and that the seller needs to provide upon reasonable notice, access to the property for appraisals and inspections, risk of loss. If for some reason after the effective date but before closing the property is damaged by fire and the cost does not exceed 1.5% of the purchase price, cost of restoration shall be an obligation of seller and closing shall proceed pursuant to terms of the contract. If restoration is not completed as a closing, a sum equal to 125% of estimated cost of complete restoration, not to exceed 100% of closing. Purchase price will be escrowed at closing. If actual cost of restoration exceeds escrowed amount, the seller shall pay such actual costs, but not in excess of 1.5% of purchase price. Any unused portion of escrow amount shall be returned to seller. If cost of restoration exceeds 100% of purchase price, buyer shall elect to either take property as is, together with 100%, or receive a refund of the deposit, thereby releasing everybody from their obligations under this contract. If your buyer is purchasing this property as a 1031 exchange, so you got a 1031 exchange expert. We are not in this brokerage, so you must have a 1031 exchange expert on hand to seek that out. The contract is not recorded. Persons bound, notice, delivery copies, contract execution. What that means is that this contract is not recorded in public record. A copy is delivered to all parties involved, the attorneys, the realtors, and the buyer and seller. Integration and modification, it contains a full, complete understanding and agreement of buyer and seller. This contract is between buyer and seller only, and that no other person, only changes are in writing and it's executed by the parties intended by between it. The failure of buyer and seller to insist in compliance with or strict performance of any provisions of the contract or take advantage shall not constitute a waiver of provisions. Writer's agenda, typewritten or handwritten provisions shall control all printed versions of the contract. Collection or collected means any checks tendered or received, including deposits that become actually and finally collected and deposited in the account of escrow agent or closing agent. Closing and disbursement of funds and delivery of closing documents may be delayed. C is not used. Applicable law and venue. The contract shall be construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Florida. 553 talks about FERPTA tax withholding. Again, this goes to talk about more of that in detail. I suggest if there is a FERPTA, if the seller is involved in FERPTA, then you should notify the attorney ASAP and just get in touch with them and talk to them about it. Buyer waiver of claims. If there's any issues after closing, the buyer does not hold the broker, the seller, or anybody liable, except in cases where it should be the case, obviously. If there are any particular addenda that you're using that are listed here, you would check the box. If it's not listed, you would check this box here and then type in the name of it here. Additional terms, you might type in waterfront credit buyer Joe Smith, 500 towards his closing. There's actually wording for that. So when you're seeking that out, let me know. Buyer and seller assigned. You need each of their addresses for notices. And then you would type in your name, type in the listing agent, or vice versa. and then the broker that they belong to. There's an initial on the bottom of every page. Loop takes that into account when you share that information out. And that's it. That's how to fill out the contract. So there's a lot to take in. Take it as you do. And I suggest just fill out a contract every now and again. Share it with the manager. Share it with me. Hey, am I filling this out right? A couple of things like that. But, takes time, takes practice. You're not going to get it right the first time. You won't get it right the 100th time. That's usually how it goes. I do recommend there are monthly classes at our Naples Area Board of Realtors that they teach. Attend that class every month, and you'll find yourself being a contract pro in no time. For now, that's all. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about the NABOR listing contract for rentals. All right. Thanks so much, guys, and have yourself a great rest of the day.